Portugal, there's a YouTube show full of fun facts you need to know.
Hola, bon dia, alegria. Munson here with the Good Morning Portugal show. And it is a podcast and it is a live stream this evening, a special Portugal Club recording. And ordinarily, we do these off air with a Portugal Club audience. This is a little bit different. If you are a Portugal Club member, do let me know. You can join us backstage in the studio. And if you're not, why not? Go find out what advantages and benefits you can get by being a member of the Portugal Club at gmpvip.com. Or if you want to type more characters in, theportugalclub.com. Now, my guest this evening, a very interesting gentleman, who he's giggling already behind the scenes. I honestly don't know where to start with this man. He's a fascinating fellow who sent me a biog at my request, which has bowled me over, and an extraordinary CV, which we'll talk about. And I have to say, somebody who posted a message in one of my WhatsApp groups, and I said, that's not really San Martino de Porto stuff. That's more world affairs. That's more geopolitical commentary, and there's a time and a place for that. It's not this WhatsApp group, but you know what? It might be tonight. So let's give him a nice big round of applause and welcome him. Remembering that admonishment recently. How are you, Ali?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you so much for your generous introduction.
Well, a stunning CV for sure. And maybe we can set the scene by finding out a little bit more about you. And how you got to be in Portugal, because this is all about being in Portugal. And of course, as I said, there are some interesting things going on in the world about which you have, I think, some very interesting views, which became apparent when you did join us at our meetup last week. And we were sat around the table, weren't we, with American friends. I'm a Brit. I don't know your nationality, but I know your perspective is absolutely fascinating, and I think you wowed the people sat with us at the table. You certainly did me. So it'd be good to unpack a bit of that this evening. So where are you from, and how did you get to be in Portugal, first of all?
Well, I'm originally from Pakistan, but then I left the country early in my career and worked for the United Nations for about 25 years. I got to the United Nations because I was working for a non-profit sector in Pakistan, worked for Catholic Leave Services for about 3 years, and then moved on to join UNICEF. And then from UNICEF, I went on to become international, served in Yemen for a couple of years, then about 5 years in Central Asia, 5 years in the Philippines, 5 years in Nepal, 3-4 years in Ankara, Jordan, and then finally ended up in Portugal.
Wow. How so? I mean, that's quite the list, isn't it? To end up here in like very peaceful Portugal compared to some of the places you've been and some of the situations you've been in.
Yes, indeed. I think that part of the reason why we ended up in Portugal, and perhaps it was a bit early, because I still had time to serve the United Nations for a few more years. When I decided that I think things had gotten to a point where I wanted to, there are events in your life when you say, okay, do you want to compromise your values or give up your integrity, or you want to have money? And so, it sort of came down to that final knockout where it said, okay, I think I would not change or give up my values. I would rather give up the money. And I think I thought at that time I had enough of it already, so I didn't really need to make any more.
Well, good on you. The world needs more people, I think, taking that view and making that choice. Not that it's easy, of course. We all need to survive and live, don't we? But if you are able to make that choice, which you've clearly done, all power to your very talented elbows. And now we discover as well, I mean, you're not one to let the grass grow or to not be busy and engaged with your objective, as I'm reading here on your CV, to find opportunities to serve vulnerable and disadvantaged population groups with the specific aim of creating a humane and just society for all. Even though you've turned your back on some of the higher earning work where you may have had to hide your light a little bit, that's not stopped you getting involved in a project here in Portugal. You're the founder director of Health4EquityEvora, which is in the process of incorporation, and it's in its ideation phase with support from Empowered Startups Portugal and the University of Evora, Portugal. And I think that the tile that I've used for tonight's live stream is perhaps you talking about that in what looks like a very cold building. And that's as recent as this February, I think. You've made your impact here in Portugal as well. Could you tell us a bit about that project?
Well, it's still, I think that it's sort of still, getting to a point where we need to crystallize what we want to do. The burgeoning field of artificial intelligence and health is a very, very big area and still growing like at exponential rates. So it's very difficult to find your feet. But over the last year, we have done some demographic research on Portugal, looking at what is happening to the population as it grows and it ages. And the question has always been, how do you really keep Portugal on a trajectory of growth, both economic and social growth, as their population ages? And it's a huge challenge, and lots of people are becoming aware of this challenge. And my sort of answer to that question is, given the increase in life expectancy, mostly in Portugal and in many European countries, should we consider 60s or mid 60s a point in time where we should just give up everything and just sit at the beach and have lunches, or should we be engaged in something more constructive and productive to help the society do better? And the conclusion is that, and given my sort of background and understanding of the importance of social connectedness, meaningfulness, and purpose that is associated with with life and its longevity, the answer consistently comes up with the fact that we need to actually do something to re-engage people in my sort of cohort to come back to active life and help Portugal come along. So one very quick example of that is something that I did in the Philippines, where we tried to partner some of the very experienced civil servants from the private sector to sit with their municipalities. And one of the consistent problem in the Philippines was the very entrenched bureaucracy and the slow progress that people were making in terms of being able to get answers from their daily lives. And that experiment with placing some of the experienced private sector people in municipalities at sort of no cost to the municipalities was a very interesting example of trying to sort out the bureaucratic hurdles and putting in some private sector practices into the public sector to help people deal with their daily life issues that they were encountering. And so that's one example of how you could actually use people like who have good experience in private sector to be able to mobilize and pace things along. And from your life in Portugal, and I've consistently heard people about how difficult it is to deal with bureaucratic structures, and still seems to be a bottleneck in terms of Portugal getting a good economic growth rate. So that's just one example, but there's lots of other things that can be done to both give meaningful and sense of belonging to people who are still productive, and still be able to help Portugal grow at a faster rate than it is right now.
I absolutely love this, and that's, I think, is that the equity you speak of, the social equity, the kind of intellectual capital that's tied up possibly in the people who are coming. And the image that comes to mind, Alim, is how, in a way, the demographics you describe of an aging population, not just in Portugal, this is happening all over Europe, isn't it? The people, and the world, in fact, where populations are not replacing themselves. There is a growing aging population. There is a younger population which sees no future in its own country and moves elsewhere, very much a Portuguese problem. And so what we've got, in a way, is a Titanic metaphor, where the newcomers are in the pool on the Titanic cruise ship, aren't they? They're in the bar and they're by the pool, when they could actually be helping those in the engine room and the navigation of the vessel into not the end we know of with the Titanic. Is that a fair metaphor for what's going on in our world and in this country at the moment?
I would say so. I think that there's a bit more help needed for better navigation with people with foresight. And
Yes.
those people you have in the pool. And the problem is that that pool is not being looked at, or is sort of lying dormant somewhere, in nursing homes and people strolling on the street and having lunches. And these people are very, very helpful and productive. And if you actually get them to mobilize, they could really make a huge difference in the society. But that's just one part of it. The other part of it is the inequity part that, I mean, you would be surprised to hear that 25% of children in UK are considered poor, by what you call multi-dimensional poverty standards. Uh, in developed countries, there are pockets of developing countries or underdeveloped countries living within those developed countries in one sense.
Yeah.
It is difficult to escape this terminology of developed and developing or underdeveloped kind of stuff. But essentially, it is to say that countries with high GDP growth and more industrialized base still have small pockets of suburban slums,
Yeah.
people with very low life expectancy, children being poor and malnourished. And it's kind of inequity that stares in your face. You see it more blatantly when you go to countries like Pakistan or Bangladesh or others, but you see this in small central cities in Europe, everywhere. And the
Yes.
question is, what is really happening? How is it that that the representational system is not working? Why is it that people are unable to voice and get these concerns addressed by the mainstream? Why is the policy failing to meet these needs? And if you lose cognitive capital in early life, in early childhood, which is a very precious time, the first 300 days, first 1,000 days of a child is when the 90% of the brain is formed. And if you lose that cognitive capital building at that time, then this is a lifetime of a loss over that child's life. So it's a very, very important part of life, which needs much more attention and specific targeted attention to areas which need better focused budgeting process, better budget help from the central government for the municipalities that need that kind of help. So it's kind of both micro and macro problem. It's at the
Yeah.
micro level, the household level, it's really much more immediate. But from the macro perspective, the governments need to become aware of this problem. And I've worked in this area for over 10, 15 years, where I've looked at poverty across different sections of society, different demographics, and different dimensions. You can be poor in health, you can be poor in education, you can be poor in social protection in different ways.
Yes.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And fair to say, I mean, there are all sorts of things that come to mind. This is a very, very interesting timing, certainly for the idea for foreigners who are coming to Portugal who want to give back. There's no lack of willingness and interest in contributing to the society that's welcomed them. So there is that, and it's like an idea that whose time has come. When I spoke to Portuguese friends recently, business people, the pieces of Portuguese society are all in place for incredible, that we have an incredible natural culture among Portuguese. Portugueseness is a very beautiful, valuable. It's not a commodity. It's just the nature of the country is amazing, and the country can clearly embrace technological change and progress very well, as we see with some projects. And then we have traditional problems, cultural problems of a public sector that maybe isn't so ready to take on private sector drive and enthusiasm and innovation. And the key problem they recognized, these two Portuguese business people friends, was a leadership issue. Who's leading this? So that then brings us to another aspect of this, which is, I think, the governments that you're mentioning, that you're talking about, that level of leadership, the macro, they're distracted at the moment, are they not? This is an extraordinary time in which to speak of the halcyon and idealistic ideals which you so believe in, whilst the ears of governments and politicians are ringing with global upheaval and chaos. And you and I have talked about that. That's very much on the agenda at the moment. How do we
Indeed.
bring all these things together?
Well, you remind me of a joke in Pakistan where they say that the policeman stopped a car with 4 people in the car, and he asked who was driving, and they said, "We don't know. We will all sit in the back seat." So, so this is what we have right now. I mean, if you ask somebody, they say nobody is supposed to be held accountable. Everybody's sitting in the back seat. We don't know. The next guy, you just catch the next guy, basically.
Yes.
So I think you're right. I think the problem to me seems to be, as you were saying, I think if I put it in another way, it would be that you have a huge amount of social capital, which you would call Portuguese-ness. I mean, it's like you
Yes.
have social capital, and it's like sitting on a red light with the engine on the with the foot on the accelerator. It's like you are pushing the full clutch and you're still on the accelerator, and the engine is going, but it's not going anywhere. It's like you have this whole potential that's running on a stationary car. And the other issue, the real issue is the alignment of human resources. So when you talk about leadership, I think that's part of the alignment of human resources, where can you really get that mix of human resources that can then get the foot off the clutch and get the engine move forward, basically.
Yeah, get
um,
some rubber on the road and get things moving in the right direction. And then Gabby, very thoughtfully here, good to see you tonight, Gabby. Thank you for joining us. There is this problem of what might we call it? Western denial. I'm not sure. It looks like everything's fine, and I'm sure that's how a lot of people want it to be seen and regarded. However, you mentioned the UK and those alarm. I wasn't surprised. I was shocked, but not surprised. This is how things are at the moment, isn't it? You're shocked to hear a staggering statistic, but then when you think about it, you're not surprised because we know the conditions that create this. Gabby has just done a similar research for Germany. Around 20 to 21% of children in Germany are considered to be living in poverty or at risk of poverty. That's about 2.9 million children under the age of 18. What's happening? I mean, this is the engine of Europe, is it not? And the EU project and so on. How can this be so? How can we be so in denial? And again, I'm asking you some really big questions tonight, but I do so because I think you have a very interesting perspective on what's going on.
Yeah, I remember reading an article by Martin Wolf, who writes in Financial Times. I think he sort of succinctly explains it in a very interesting way. He says that, in the late 20th century, the partnership between democracy and capitalism was very good. Democracy and capitalism were sort of like sisters, and they both helped each other out to get to a point, and that led to a spurt in growth in many parts of the world, especially in the western part of the world. And that had to do a lot with honoring of the social contract between citizens and the state.
Yes.
For example, in the US, you had this whole social security policy that came up in 60s and 70s, and very high income taxes on people, even up to 80%. And equality re-emerged in society, and the society's engine was in the right place. In Europe, you had Bismarckian, pension plans, social protection plans that started off the German state at that time. In the UK, you had this very powerful NHS services, and UK was always known as a nation built on municipal governments. Decentralized, powerful municipalities or districts that were running their own affairs.
Really?
All of that social contract was sort of derailed in late 80s and 90s when the neoliberal economics came up, and deregulation started as the mantra, where every sector was thought to be too highly regulated, and deregulation was thought to sort of unleash the real potential of capital. Eventually, what happened was that a class emerged that took advantage of this unregulation, or I would now call it dysregulation, in fact, and then captured basically the real processes of democracy. And I call it representational deficits. So on the outside, everything looks fine and normal. It seems like democracies are working, you get to vote, but really your voice is not heard. So millions of people go out in the street, and you have these congresses, you have these national assemblies, you have the parliaments. They still legislate and do whatever they want to do, and don't really pay attention to what millions of people are saying. The UK went to war in Iraq with millions of people protesting in the streets of London not to do it. You still have today, every week, protests in London on what is happening in Palestine, and yet nothing really changes. And what you have here then essentially is a disintegration of the social contract. A social contract was built around sound democracies, which meant that people's views were represented and policies were reflected of public welfare and their views. And that is not happening anymore. So the social contract is broken. And I think that unless there is a renegotiation of the social contract, and the representational deficits are resolved, you will not have any resolution to what we are now seeing in the direction that Europe is going. I mean, we know that Europe, because of the policies that the leftist liberals who sort of wholly bought into neoliberal economics, have failed the people of those countries. I was giving you an example of Jordan, where I lived for a while, and I saw many Jordanians complaining about the fact that their children are not going to school, while the refugees living in the next hamlet have all the facilities that they don't have. And it was shocking to me, because I thought, well, why is it that Jordanians are resentful of the refugees? And then I figured out that actually the Jordanian government was not making policies to fulfill all the rights of their own citizens, and and started to seem to be paying more attention to the vulnerable populations without having some sort of an equity.
Yeah,
And
right.
that is what is happening. So everywhere you see the turn towards the far right, because it's not that people like far right, it's that people don't like the ambiguous decision-making process that the leftist liberals are following. And that, I think, is the real problem.
Very interesting. And I was going to ask you how you would frame and understand the rise of Chega specifically here in Portugal. And that would be it, would it? That would be your analysis of the tendency for incumbent governments to be a little bit too introspective and ideological and not actually take care of their population breeds a resentment that can only be heard through these really brash ballot box reactions.
Yeah, I think the problem is that when I was working with many governments, in South Asia and others, I realized that the time horizon for the politicians to look for is about 4 or 5 years at best.
Absolutely, yeah,
of course. They really don't think in terms of decades, and from our studies in the UN that I was working with, we realized that actually to sustainably move a nation from stage 1 of development to stage 2 of development, it takes at least 20 years of consistent high educational investment policies. Yeah. You need to put something like 7 to 8% of your GDP in education to move the full capacity of the nation into real good productive capacities. And 20 years is too long for a politician to think about, because all they think is about a 4-year cycle of superficial interests and constructing a building here or a clinic there. And I saw this consistently in the southern part of the world, the eastern part of the world, where I felt this was the real problem there. And I see the same process replicated here, where it seems that the short-term interests sort of ride over the long-term national interests. And then people say, okay, so why is this not happening? It's because you have politicians who have been voted in who are not really oriented towards the long-term national strategies. They are really looking at just short-term gains and getting back into the parliament.
A lack of vision and leadership. Strangely enough, that I've been listening to a lot of geopolitical videos just in the last 72 hours, and I think one country that fares well in terms of long-term planning is China. The rest of the world, with its 5-year terms, generally speaking, and it's not even that long, is it, here in Portugal, as has been demonstrated in the last year. When politicians are obsessed with their own survival within a 5-year maximum, how can they possibly animate a longer term plan, the likes of which I think we have seen in Portugal, to be fair? That educational aspiration that you spoke of, I think, was very much a post-revolution concept, but it was perhaps driven by the culture and the people more than it might have been driven by individual politicians. I'm not entirely sure, so please don't burn me up in the comments about that. But it would appear that visions held collectively where politicians can be held accountable in the light of those aspirations might stand a better chance than entrusting it completely to short-termist politicians or career.
Yes, I would agree. I think that the real problem is that you don't have, there is as we had earlier said, there's a lack of leadership in the sense that it is very difficult for leaders to take any criticism, and they would sort of listen to the last person who has whispered into their ear. We have a good example in the Big Brother, who we all know what is happening right now in the American democracy. The last person who whispers into the president's ear is the one who gets the next policy change. So the question is, are we going to keep making policies that way? Are parliaments really representative of people's views? Are constituencies being faithfully represented in the parliament? And whether the policy process that actually takes place in the parliament is reflective of aspirations. And unfortunately, if you look at it from a very close perspective, and I've looked at it from a very micro perspective, I've been in touch with lots of politicians. I have sat in meetings where I've seen these being discussed, and eventually, it all boils down to the growth of people and their maturity and how secure or insecure they are. Eventually a politician is a person, and with the way societies have sort of been traumatized over the last 60, 70 years with the world wars and with constant conflicts, one must also recognize the fact that this is one of the best periods of human history where you have had a lot of people getting actually a modest amount of income. Infant mortalities are very low. Poverty is actually at a historic low in the human history. But also are the sharp divisions, also the equity of insight because of the social media, and people feeling the difference is the sensitivity is a bit more, is a lot more than before. Because I remember when I was growing up, there was no television, there was no social media, so one was just happy in one's a small cocoon. Even with small amount of money, it was okay. But now, even with a lot of money, you always see the huge difference between you and other people, and social media plays a large role in the consumerist culture, and telling you don't have it, you should be unhappy, you should be doing something more, and that is
especially when we're told that things have never been better, which we can accept on a kind of on that grossest level of measuring against the history of all time. Things are certainly better for humanity, but on an individual basis, as you say, when it doesn't look like that for you personally, that makes a big difference. And you brought trauma up and I remember now when we spoke over lunch the other day, that seemed to be a significant matter to you in terms of the world population and how we are, as I guess, as you put it, the unrepresented in the representational deficit. If people are finding that they are feeling unrepresented, but they're also living against the background of trauma, which I don't think a lot of people would necessarily recognize or realize. That's a pretty poor equation for a productive society. Could you say more? Could you unpack that a little bit about the generalized trauma of the last few decades, as I think you referred to it?
Yeah, I think one part of that trauma is essentially the violence that the generations have gone through from the First to Second World War, and the consistent war on what they call now terrorism. It's been like the 20 years since the events of 9/11 that we have seen this happening across the world. But also, I think that part of the trauma has to do with the history. Part of it has to do with the fact that people are, with the images bombarding you. If you look at social media and you're into geopolitics, you pick up your phone in the morning and you are presented with horrible pictures, every day in the morning, and you don't really understand what it does to you because it sort of goes inside and it sort of stays there, and your mind sort of chews on it, while you might think you are sort of impermeable and you have sort of desensitized yourself to those images, but actually it does a lot of damage within yourself. And I think that this is giving rise to both a leadership culture and general society, which is becoming more and more sort of narcissistic. So you have political culture which is quite narcissistic. You have to be a narcissist to be a successful political leader, because you have to not pay attention to what other people are saying. You have to think that you're right no matter what you do, and
Yes.
that's a absolute good characteristic of a narcissist. So essentially, we are now living in a in societies who have been taken over by narcissistic leaders, and
Yes.
it poses even more danger because they are not open to understanding of diverse views, and very impermeable to getting feedback about their behaviors. You see
Yes.
this in corporations, you see this in nation states, you see that at municipal level. All the leadership is this way, and it's very unfortunate. But that's what we're suffering from, and we don't know how long it will take for generations to heal. Because interestingly enough, because I'm a doctor, I know that trauma actually gets passed on in your genes to your next generation. It translates into genetic material that you actually pass on to your next generation, both from a genetic point of view and also from a conditioning point of view or nurture point of view, not just the nature point of view. And
Yes, indeed.
so it's passed on. So it's multi-generational, and it's like a multi-generational trap that needs a lot of understanding of your own behavior. It can be changed. And I was born in also a very difficult family with in poverty, and until I was in my mid 40s, I didn't realize what had really happened to me. So it was really a 5 to 10 years of understanding and struggle of what I went through in terms of traumatic experience in my own life, and to really use that. Interestingly enough, what the psychologists now say is that you are totally conditioned for most of your life by 7 years of age. So your
Yes.
patterns of behavior are basically totally fully matured when you are 7 years of age, and the rest of the life you repeat those patterns, in fact. And
Yeah.
you repeat those patterns until you become aware of some sort of an understanding that you're not doing it right. And
Yeah.
some people do become aware, so they can actually use then the 10% of their plastic brain to alter their neural connections to really return to or sort of heal their trauma, and then gradually heal their further generations if they have children. But if you
Yes.
don't become aware, then that is just passed on unbeknowingly to your generations and to people around you. In fact, you don't even realize that you're doing that, but it happens and it sort of spreads. It's like I would say that most people say, well, what is the characterizing epidemic in today's society? And I would say it is multi-generational trauma.
Wow. I don't disagree. And I think there's a number of speakers who are emerging. Gabor Mate, for example, there are people who are acknowledging this in some way, some shape or form. And it's very important to me here at Good Morning Portugal, and generally how I roll here, Alim, to, as well as being open to what's going on, the reality of life, and such as it's been laid out so far. I suspect you're also a hopeful person, as well as being very realistic and honest about what the plight of the world. And that's what I'd like to move on to, if possible. I believe you're a man of faith and hope and clearly of compassion and a vision. And I wrote this morning, I was just celebrating my 100th article in the Portugal Resident, and I think there are my four horsemen of the current apocalypse
Not the apocalypse. Yeah.
are the globe. The number one is global upheaval, and I think you'd have had to have your head under a rock to not have a sense of that. I think that's a given. Rapid technological change and mainly AI and all of that represents is another that's coming our way that I think is quite unsettling for people. In our context, where we are, and I think it's important to pay attention to not be too ideological and philosophical, but be in the reality of where you are, which is Europe, where we are. And there's something. Europe is going through an identity crisis as well, isn't it? There is something really extraordinary happening to Europe that I think we talked about before that isn't really being acknowledged or recognized. And the fourth thing, where I think the hope lies or abides, as it were, is how we might be in a moment, a historical moment, given those things that are characterizing a huge change for humanity. A moment of nuclear climax and devastation, people's worst fear, but also on the other side of that coin, an incredible moment of possible transformation that is perhaps, the metaphors are like, the Mayan or the Aquarian realization of a new moment of evolution for humanity. Do you share that? Do you see that as a possibility? And are we having this conversation because out of this could come something quite extraordinary? And is that why you stay speaking of possibility and vision?
Yes, absolutely. I think that while you were speaking, lots of thoughts are running through my own mind. I do believe that I'm very optimistic about the day after. Although the cost that will be paid before that day would be enormous.
Yes.
And we talked about these interesting studies about how how inequality rises consistently until there is a catastrophic event that brings back equality back to human society. And this is a research by several interesting professors who have talked about different events in human history where inequality reached to a breaking point, and then a catastrophic event like an epidemic or a war or something happens, and then things return to a new equilibrium. And that new equilibrium is about, I would think, as you were mentioning, it's about expansion of identity, in the sense that there is a process of inclusion that sort of gets cultivated in that process of change,
Yes.
because when the colonial expansion happened, and Portugal was part of the colonial expansion, Portuguese went to. I just had a guest from Cabo Verde who was who was a doctor from Caldas, and we were talking about this. And European colonial expansion went to several countries, and then for instance, when I was considering about where to retire, one of the first choices I was thinking about was UK. And why? Because I could speak English. So
Yeah.
in one sense, my thought process is actually a prisoner of my discourse and my language abilities.
Yes.
And that is what happens to people who are sort of colonized. Their generations are educated in those languages, so their identity actually comes partly from their colonial master in one sense.
Yes, indeed.
And you want to sort of be in a place where you can actually communicate and connect. You don't really understand how those previous colonies or colonizers see you actually. Now, lots of people in Portugal are not coming just because of language, but lots of people in UK go from the previous colonies into UK because they know language. And I know a lot of people who would have the choice to go to Germany, but they would opt for UK because they can speak English.
Yeah.
So I think that, and then, of course, these governments protest about, these people ending up and being a burden on the social care and everything else. But the fact is that the identity of an Englishman cannot be confined to just a white Englishman speaking English. But when you colonize, your identity had to expand.
Yes.
And I think Portuguese did a bit of a better job in that, in the sense that when
Yes.
they went, it was not as exploitative as the UK. Sorry about about that, but essentially, the people who come back to Portugal or who have in their colonies still have a sense of some sense of national identity, and expansion of national identity would mean that the Portuguese or the English or the French expand their sense of cultural and national identity to incorporate these incoming people, because that would lead to harmonization. Instead of protesting and saying, no, we want to remain white, English, and confined to this identity. So I think that somehow that process is going to be broken open, and people will realize actually that they have sort of multiple identities, and they need to sort of reconcile and harmonize those identities. And that inclusionary process will then start sustaining smaller communities, starting from the smaller communities, going and growing bigger from smaller communities. It's going to be an organic process. That's what I believe. For instance, now in Caldas, and we were talking about this, Portugal is such a small piece of, is sort of a land of peace in this huge turmoil that we see across the world is growing, and the turmoil is growing, and we don't know when it will reach here. But certainly, we have time to inculcate these sort of pieces of the puzzle and resolve these problems here in our small communities. And you I think are a pioneer in that sense, that you brought this connectivity, getting people together and having to talk to each other. You have this ability to connect different people, and I think it's a really precious and interesting ability to have, in the sense that then you can have these inclusionary process expand,
Yeah.
where people can learn from each other and not see the other as the other, but part of themselves.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. It's interesting because I think it is a trauma response, and it comes from a theme which I wanted to talk to you about today as well, which is having an Eastern mother and a Western father. And whilst you were talking, it reminded me, and sadly I can't think of the man's name. He's a Nigerian philosopher and artist. I think he's like a conceptual artist philosopher who I saw on a video recently, was recommended to me. And he is no longer talking about black and white. He's talking about blackness and whiteness as I don't know, how that can haunt and possess people, and how if we look at it as a concept of that kind, we can be free from it in a way that clearly the opposite's happening. We're imprisoned by these ideas, aren't we? And we are using these ideas to other each other, as it were, which is only prolonging the pain and difficulty and the challenge we face, I think, even though it is on one level an understandable response, because people really don't know what to do in an absence of leadership and great ideas. Before we go on to East and West, which I think you have a very interesting angle on, point of view, Bob is delighted to hear this discussion. I think great to hear this discussion. Thank you both. I'm glad your guest pointed out we can become aware of the generational trauma we carry and that we can deal with it. Dramatic change for me. Well, thank you for sharing that, Bob. And I don't know many people, Alim, I have to say, who can mix geopolitical awareness with trauma, with the effect of trauma. I've never heard anybody really make that case, although it makes absolute and complete sense to me in the way I think it does to Bob here. And until we embrace that, I don't think we stand much of a chance to really understand what's going on inside us, as well as the projection of what's going on the outside. Now, on this matter of East and West, it was fascinating. And I'm sorry if this does sound like a bit sort of trite or patronizing, but a table with a Brit, predominantly, I'm a white man to all intents and purposes from UK, even though my mother's from the Far East. It's interesting to see how much lives in identity and is consumed and conditioning and so on. But there we were, Brits and UK, US around the table with yourself. And I thought you just had an Eastern view, if you like. And I don't know if that is, and that's why I'm apologizing for being trite or patronizing, but it's a different view. And it's a view that you can uniquely have in where you've grown up and how you've seen us in the West in a way we just cannot see ourselves, because we've grown up in our own light and shadow and propaganda and bullishness and all those things. I don't know how to ask the question, but can you unpack that a little bit? What are you seeing? What do you see from that point of view that we can't see about ourselves?
Well, when we discussed this, and I thought just now when we talked about the geopolitical aspects of trauma, the other aspect of this, which links to your question, is what I call the economic structural violence.
Right.
There is social violence and there is the economic violence. And yes, when I mention economic violence, I talk about somebody like Piketty and others who have written about this. The fact that the living wages of labor have stagnated over the last 30 years. So people at the lower rung of society, their wages have not increased. And what has increased essentially is the productivity of labor that is totally consumed by those who are putting their money in the banks and actually holding money. So you have a risk-free, profit-making institutions like a bank that keeps your money, and if you have $1 million, you can just multiply it risk-free, putting it in the bank vault. While a laborer will labor for years and years for that kind of money without really having a rewarding wage. And we know that true in Portugal.
Yeah, right.
So that difference has been rising. And that gives rise to what I call an economic structure that is violent in nature, in the sense that every day a laborer will get up and is unable to break through the cycle of poverty or the cycle of being able to make ends meet, is a structural violence to their system, to their humanity, to their self and dignity. And that is an additional part of what I call the ongoing trauma in societies, in capitalist societies, which have essentially let the markets become gods in one sense.
Yeah.
It's like a culture, and I believe that that trauma multiplies to the sense of wanting to become numb to the situation, and gives rise to a lot of problems like addiction, for instance. We talked about this, and part of the reason why trauma leads to addiction is because you want to numb yourself to the sensations of this injustice, that pain that you would actually which will become unbearable in one sense if you don't numb yourself.
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
that all goes into another area which we could talk about some point in time later, but the whole theory of addiction and why it happens in the first place.
Yes.
But I think the part of the structural violence has to also do with the history of European civilization, where until the Westphalian structure of the nation state and the agreement between different European powers about finding their boundaries and becoming nation states, uh, it led was built on a huge amount of bloodshed. Millions of people were lost. German populations lost half of their people, about 50 million people in that process. 170 million people died in Europe in the First and Second World War. 27 million of those Russians. And to me, there's a very interesting Chinese scholar who's written about this. And he essentially says that this is about the fact that Western nations have decided that they want to be equal to each other. And equality will always breed conflict, because there is no hierarchy of what is better or what is not better or not is good. I was talking to some people yesterday at my home, and I was saying that in our life we all agree on a fair inequality.
Yes.
For instance, I was telling them, let's say that I can always very confidently say that my mother loves me more than me. So in one sense, she's actually superior in love to me, and I have
Yes.
no hesitation or embarrassment in accepting it, that I'm her inferior in love in one sense, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
and it's entirely fine. People will like it actually when I say it, but
I just did.
yeah,
Yes.
and but if you say that in an economic sense, it will be violent. You'll say, oh, you earn less than me. But that's a very insulting thing, basically. But
Yes.
in terms of hierarchy of love, there is a hierarchy of love, and we all recognize it.
Yes.
There's also a hierarchy of economy, in the sense that if somebody works harder for 12 hours a day and is more educated than me, I can understand that they earn more than me. That's okay. I have no problem with that, as long as I can see that there is a difference in potentials and the hard work that they're putting in. But if somebody comes from a rich family and they don't work hard and I'm working hard, and they earn more than me, then I have a problem with that. That's unfair inequality. So
Yes.
humans are okay with fair inequality, and that's okay. It's natural, it's prevalent, and we all know about it. Now,
You could say we're overwhelmed, though, now with unfair inequality, right? Rather than the inequality we could accept.
sorry, come back.
It looks like we're overwhelmed with unfair inequality rather than managing on an amount of inequality that we could see as being okay.
Yes, I agree. I think that, and I also that's also a part of a response, a trauma response in one sense, because you
Yeah.
can't really see the things for what they are. And I think in the East, there is a sort of a hierarchy of ideologies or philosophies. For example, China has had this Confucian ideology of governance for 2000, 2500, 5000 years, basically. And
Yes.
Chinese neighbors who came to China, like Korea and Japan and others, they came and they actually found Confucius to be an inspiring figure. And so they went back and they said, okay, we will agree to a certain sense of inequality, although it's fair inequality in the sense that whoever is more indulged or more aware of Confucian ideology we would be able to listen to them, and in the sense we will learn from them. And that we do all the time in secular sciences. Somebody knows physics more than me, I'm fine. I can learn from them, and that's okay. It doesn't bother me. If I was egoistical and traumatized, it would probably bother me. So
Yes, right.
I think that the West has fought more battles and more conflicts and more wars than the eastern part of the world, where I come from, where we tend to sort of agree on certain levels of inequality.
Right.
Some of them could be violent also. I don't deny that. But some parts of them actually create peace, because then you say, okay, here's a hierarchy, and I fit here, and I find that okay for me. It's like I can live with this.
And the
That's not
incredible
possible
irony,
here.
no, and the
Sorry?
incredible irony with this, Alim, is
Yeah.
that we would say, the Eastern people, they have a terrible sort of feudal inequality where they look down on each other, and we have exactly the same thing, but we just call it a different name, don't we?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and on it
And
goes.
yeah. Unfortunately, I think that more and more it all appears to be the same, in the sense that you have now um, censors, you have curbs on speech, lot more laws in terms of what can be said, what cannot be said, which one used to ascribe to Chinese authoritarianism and the censors in Chinese discourse and everything else. It's now all coming back to Europe. You have situations in Germany, in the UK, and the US where you can't speak up about certain things. When I was coming on your show, I was worried. I would say, well, should I say everything, or should I just hold myself back? Because who knows, somebody will knock on my door.
Isn't that a sad thought? Isn't that a sad thought? And hopefully that won't come our way by some, hopefully ever. But and we can avoid those sorts of worst excesses that are clearly happening, perhaps in the UK, most notably, with their current experiment. But I would like to conclude on a hopeful note. I mean, we get it, don't we? We get it. We've got some big challenges ahead, and sort of maybe bringing it back full circle to you, because this is an introduction to you as a member of our community as well. How do you resolve these incredible challenges and the precipice of huge change which might come about by some huge disaster? How do you stay hopeful and light and resourceful and with vision?
Well, one of the things that happened to me, and I think that sort of is part of my own history, is that I decided to join a reform movement within Islam that holds the motto of love for all and hatred for none. And it's a pacifist movement that was born in India about 100 years back. And we believe as Muslims, we should give life, not take life. So for instance, we just arranged a blood donation occasion where we went and donated blood, because we believe that giving life is more important than taking life. And this is to fellow citizens, irrespective of whether their nationality is or caste or creed or religion. It is for humanity, basically. So I'm very deeply plugged into that sort of a movement, which is now has a growing following across the world. It's a pacifist movement which is wholly against any form of violence in the name of religion, and stands for inclusive salvation. For all religions, for all peoples across the world, who all are sort of children of one God, basically. So that is a great source of peace for me, because I've sort of resolved that, sense of, am I the only one who's going to go to heaven? I think everyone is going there, and it's all it's all love in one sense, which is represented by the sense of this supreme being that we all call God or Allah or whatever that is, basically. And the other part of this is that I've tried to use my resources to help a Portuguese university. As I was mentioning to you, I have just finished sort of remodeling a house where I've tried to get some Portuguese people to live with me, so they can find accommodation at lower costs. Because one of the biggest criticism I've heard about new people coming into the country is that Portuguese people are sort of thrown out of the houses and they are unable to find places to live. So I wanted to answer that question and to try and take initiative in that. And the third one is, of course, this where you come in is this want and desire for connections, for connectedness, and to try and play even at this point in time in life, which is true for some people, will be probably late, but to see if one could be a productive and participatory, real integral part of Portuguese society, to bring some sort of sense of community and cohesion in Portuguese society with people like us, but also to help the country along in the long-term process of economic and social growth.
How wonderful! That's a very fine. I met my own four horsemen with a holy trinity of a kind in my article that I wrote today, and I think you've done another one there. Beautiful, a three-part solution and hope there, and I thank you so much. And it's a tragedy, isn't it, that we don't hear so much of that aspect of Islam, but we know why that is, I think, as well. Maybe we shouldn't go back there right now, but it's a conversation we might have in the future. Always balanced, I hope, in the way that you have with great positivity and lightness, Alim. So I thank you so much. That 56 minutes just over has flown by. So I hope we can talk again and actually promote and move forward the very things you're talking about. I mean, your model for refurbishing your property with some sounds like social housing for Portuguese people sounds incredible. That's a model that could be replicated across the country, right?
I hope so. Yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your kind invitation and letting me come and say what I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Not at all. As long as YouTube allows that, let's hope that can persist and continue. And I look forward to speaking to you again. And Bob, I don't know which one, but certainly one of your concepts is fantastic there. I think all of them. So thanks, Bob, for making that point. Thank you for being here, Bob and Gabby and others who were listening but not commenting. If there was something you wanted to add, or if you want to join us in a similar conversation in the future, just let me know. That's what we're all about here, that connectivity that Alim talked about. So thanks again. And see you soon. Boa noite to you and até a próxima.
Boa noite. Adios.
Adios.
In Portugal, there's a YouTube show full of fun facts.